together with the Think 2030, Think Sustainable 20, together with the Think 2030 network. The Think 2030 network was launched by IEEP in 2018, and it's an evidence-based, non-partisan platform of leading policy experts from European think tanks, civil society, the private sector, and local authorities. And it focuses on producing relevant, timely, and concrete policy recommendations. The key objective of Think 2030 is to identify science policy solutions for a more sustainable Europe. And obviously today's session with the European Green Deal Barometer is a great example of the work of Think 2030. So without further ado, I'd like to pass the floor over to Caroline from GlobeScan, Caroline Home, who will take us through some of the key findings in the European Green Deal Barometer. Caroline, the floor's yours.
Thank you very much, Robert. Before we look at the findings and the full survey results, I'm going to give a quick introduction to the survey. You can find a lot more information. We have 2 reports available on the survey, and they're on the think2030.eu website and also on the globescan.com website. So please have a look at those if you want more information. Now, the purpose of the survey was to gauge potential pathways for delivering on the European Green Deal objectives by collecting views on the top issues and priorities from a diverse set of stakeholders who we'll find out more about in a moment. The plan we have is for the survey to become a regular check on perspectives of progress so that it is almost a confidence barometer on the Green Deal implementation. And our survey partners are listed here on the screen, and I would like to thank all of them for their support and their input to the design and dissemination of the survey, as well as to my colleagues, Catherine Hinson and Angèle Tass, who worked very hard on the survey. So in terms of the methodology and the timing of the survey, it was conducted online throughout December and January. The total sample was 295, so almost 300 people participated. Nearly 80% of them were from Europe, but there's also some representation from other regions that you can see on here. And there were 5 main stakeholder groups who participated. Those are from academia and think tanks, corporate and industry, NGOs, governments and regulators, and also from regional and international organizations. And over half of the sample had more than 10 years of experience in sustainability. So that's our survey sample. So we're going to have a look at some key findings from the survey, but as I said, there's a lot more information in the report that you can have a look at. So first of all, we found out that views on implementation of the Green Deal are very mixed. Only 30% think it is likely that the deal will be implemented by 2024. And when we say implementation, we mean that it will be translated into science-based targets with corresponding legislation, regulation, and public investment. A similar proportion think that it's unlikely it will be implemented in this time span. So that's those orange and red bars, red parts of the pie chart. And 40% sit somewhere in the middle. They're neutral, and those are shown in grey on the pie. And we found that Northern European countries expressed the most reservations about the Green Deal being implemented by 2024, but those outside of Europe were among the most positive compared with those within Europe. And when we look at these results by type of stakeholder, we can see that in that sort of shaded red there, that government stakeholders are actually the most sceptical. And we have just over 20% thinking it will be implemented within the time span. And in contrast, we have 35% of corporates thinking implementation is likely. So the findings do suggest that many stakeholders are aware of barriers that need to be overcome in order to implement the deal. And when we asked people about what are the top 2 barriers to implementation, we found that 1/3 of them pointed to a lack of commitment by member states. Then we also found that 1/4 identified the lack of a systemic governance approach. And then another 1/4 mentioned a multi-speed Europe and ongoing unequal progress across member states. And when we asked a bit more about that last point, we found that over half of stakeholders felt that Germany and Scandinavian countries are the most likely to do their fair share to implement the deal. But in contrast, Eastern European countries were identified as the least likely contributors. We did also ask about what were the top 2 most positive opportunities arising from the deal. And we can see on the left there that 38% of stakeholders felt that promoting low carbon circular supply chains in key emitting sectors was one of the best opportunities that the Green Deal provides. 28% identified private sector investment and accountability, and 26% said EU global leadership on the environmental agenda were key opportunities. Now, if you remember back to our first finding, we saw a lot of people sitting on the fence about the likelihood of the Green Deal being implemented. So let's just have a look at what the survey says about what needs to be done to ensure implementation. Now, first of all, we found that the survey shines a light on some specific areas where more focus is needed. And this matrix shows 2 sets of findings from the survey. The vertical axis shows stakeholder views on which of 8 thematic pillars should be prioritised as key catalysers for the whole deal. So that means that proposals that are high up on the matrix, that are near the top, are the ones that need to be prioritised for the benefit of the whole deal. Then that horizontal axis, we've got views on the amount of progress that has been made across different areas. So the further to the right the proposals are, the more progress has been made. And if you look at the top left red quadrant, you can see that we have 3 main areas of focus: an environmentally friendly food system, ecosystems and biodiversity, and then circular economy. And these are all seen as top priorities, but where progress made has been relatively weak compared with other areas. So action there on these things is considered the most urgent. And the second thing that would matter is improving familiarity and awareness of the Green Deal. And in total, we found that just under half of stakeholders said they're familiar with the deal, and a further third gave their neutral score in that grey on the right. And that does suggest that they have some knowledge of the deal. Only 7%, that little red part shows 7% of people said they're not familiar at all. And we found that government stakeholders and regulators do seem to be among the less familiar, with only a third of them saying they're familiar. And if you remember, they're also the most pessimistic group as well. Academia and think tanks do appear as the most knowledgeable. And then thirdly, there is a need for a science-based approach across the proposals. And when we asked stakeholders to rate the extent to which proposals meet what science requires, a majority of stakeholders pointed to climate and energy proposals, and those are shown towards the right of the screen there. Respondents gave us slightly more mixed views on whether EU proposals around zero pollution and sustainable food systems actually do meet science-based objectives, and those are shown over there towards the left-hand side. And then finally, collaboration among all stakeholder groups is considered critical. The bar on the left-hand side shows that a total of over 90% of stakeholders think member states are important for implementation. And then if we move over to the right, we can see that 85% rate the private sector as important, a similar proportion for local and regional authorities, 74% highlight citizens. And then finally on the right-hand side, 40% say partner countries outside of the EU are important. We also asked which organisations are most effective in implementation, and EU institutions, unsurprisingly, were mentioned most often, but also NGOs, think tanks, and multilaterals as well. So that collaborative approach is clearly needed through stronger multi-stakeholder partnerships. So those are the very quick findings that we're sharing today. As I said, all the reports and full results are available on the think2030.eu and globescan.com websites. So please go and look at more. I'm going to pass over to Celine now for some more perspectives on what the survey means.
Thank you so much, Caroline, and thanks to GlobeScan for having done such an excellent work with this very first survey on the Green Deal. Next slide. So I think before we dive into the analysis, it's worth remembering where we were at the time when the Green Deal started. It's fair to say that we were not in a great shape. According to the analysis from the EEA, Europe was likely to fail to achieve most of its objectives on the 7th Environmental Action Plan. So we had really a burning platform. We also know that on the consumption side, this is where we probably have the longest way to go. If you want to express it very simply, we would need almost 3 planet Earth to support the global economy if European consumption patterns were replicated throughout the planet by 2050. So therefore, we feel we need an absolute reduction target for material footprint. There's a very live discussion between experts as to what the range will be. We estimate the range to be 45 to 73% by 2050. So this is a massive challenge. We also know that after we thought that maybe with COVID, we would see different patterns in GHG emissions. Unfortunately, figures from the IEA show that there's a steep rebound after a steep drop. We also know that stimulus packages of leading economies, and I would like to highlight here that Europe is by far the best among the leading economies. But if we look at the amount we're talking about, and we're pumping 12.7 trillion into the global economy, and only 30% of this is dim green. It doesn't mean that 70% is brown. It's either neutral or brown, but for sure only 30% is going in for sure in the right direction. And you know, the news from the hard science are there to remind us that unfortunately we have a rapidly declining window of opportunity to stabilize our climate. And so the latest research on ice sheets is quite troubling, because it seems that most of the models were underestimating what is going on. So we see an acceleration of certain patterns in terms of climate change. Next slide. So I think it's worth to remember that the Green Deal is still very young. And I think, you know, one of the things that come out from the survey is that definitely experts are very optimistic. And there's an element that shows that despite the pandemic, people think that certainly the green transition is there to remain, and the Green Deal within it. And it's quite remarkable to see the number of proposals that have been put out by the Commission. We also see a continued very ambitious narrative, a green path for the next generation, a binding pledge for children and grandchildren. This is what Ursula von der Leyen said in terms of the recent approval of the climate law. You can see the number of approvals there, 94 proposals, 189 pending. And this is after just 12 months of the mandate. And within that, quite a few proposals specifically on the Green Deal. Some major achievements, certainly the climate law, certainly next generation EU, but also some political setbacks. So the EU taxonomy within sustainable finance, cap reform, and a super loaded legislative agenda in 2021, because obviously we are moving now from narrative to hard legislation beyond the climate law. So you see that there are a number of very important files coming our way in 2021. Next slide. So thanks. What we also asked those 300 sustainability experts is what were their key policy recommendations for the institutions. And the first one is obviously beyond climate and energy, because we see certainly in the survey that people feel there's quite good progress on climate and energy. So we ask them to focus their recommendations on other areas. So the first one, not surprisingly, is around the EU recovery funds and making sure that they are focused on low carbon and environmental projects. And obviously we will now see most, hopefully by the end of this month, if not all, plans from member states being submitted. So the day of the reckoning is coming soon, and there's a lot of expectations on how the European Commission will assess whether these plans are indeed fitting within the criteria that were set, and also you know, what would happen if certain plans are not fitting within that. Then there's a second set of recommendations regarding the circular economy. The first one is really about mainstreaming a circular economy approach in the EU industrial strategy. And experts are often talking about resource efficiency first, not just energy efficiency, but resource efficiency. And this brings a whole lot of debates, because sometimes there are dilemmas between low carbon and circularity. And then the second element is, as part of an effort to tackle consumption, include an ambitious absolute target in material footprint reduction within the Circular Economy Action Plan. And the Parliament has voiced its support for this idea. Then aligning the CAP reform and the CAP strategic plan with the farm to fork strategy. And I would say that's probably the biggest headache for everyone who is following and trying to fully implement the vision of the Green Deal, with very difficult conversations ahead. And then in terms of biodiversity, experts talked about really boosting investments in nature-based solutions, but making sure this is done in a rigorous way, which means that we really need to have robust science-based criteria on what are those activities, what are those investments that protect biodiversity and ecosystems. Next slide. Other recommendations pertain to how we're going to be monitoring the Green Deal. And experts are saying you need a harmonized and SDG-aligned monitoring framework for the whole work of the Commission, not just the European Green Deal, because we see that the European Green Deal, whatever is going on within the economic pillar, the social pillar really need to be speaking one with another, with key headline indicators running across on resilience and well-being. And underneath this, you might have different monitoring frameworks, and one of which being on the Green Deal, but always really keeping in mind the need for coherence and alignment with SDGs. In terms of leaving no one behind, in addition to obviously the just transition, experts mention empowering local and regional authorities. And there's a specific paper in Think 2030 regarding what Polish local authorities, for instance, need to make the most out of the Green Deal. But also let's not forget the youth, although we don't see them unfortunately now on the streets, but making sure that there are long-term assessments of current public policy and any sorts of proposals to ensure intergenerational equity. Position the EU as a global environmental sustainability standard setter and market creator. And it's also interesting to see that people from outside who responded to the survey have very high hopes that Europe will be able to play this role of a global leader in terms of setting standards and creating new markets. And then last but not least, the importance of raising awareness of the Green Deal among sustainability experts, starting with public officials who will be so crucial in the implementation, but also the greater public, which has not yet heard a lot about the Green Deal. So these are the first elements of the analysis. Final slide. And there's obviously much more in the report that we are publishing today. And now I want to also thank again all our partners. And Robert, the floor is yours now.
Celine, thank you very much. And thank you also to Caroline for providing the key insights from the European Green Deal Barometer. I'd like now to welcome our other panelists to this event. We have Diederik Samson, who is Head of Cabinet to the Executive Vice President Frans Timmermans, the European Commission, and Hans Brunix, who is Executive Director of the European Environment Agency. Welcome to you both. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'd like to start off by asking both of you the same question. I'm going to pose it to Hans to begin with. And I wonder whether you could reflect on anything that stood out in particular from this survey, from the barometer. Hans.
Well, thanks, and thanks for inviting me to this panel and to the launch of the barometer. First of all, congrats on the work that has been done. I think this contributes to a better understanding, primarily of how the community that is interested in the Green Deal and motivated to be a partner in implementing the Green Deal is looking at the Green Deal as a political project, but also a policy project through a critical lens. So that's clearly, I think, a new element in the debate that is welcomed. Yes, a couple of things stand out, I think. First of all, if you look at the confidence in the fact that it will be implemented at 30%, that is concerning. And it is concerning because we are, of course, dealing with what I would say is the most ambitious, most integrated, forward-looking, and hopeful policy and political project that Europe has ever formulated in this domain. And it's for the first time also framing the boundary conditions for the future economy in such an explicit way. So we can only hope that this number will go up. And I think it will go up as this political project is increasingly translated into policy packages that are indeed responding to the systemic needs, because that's another clear element. One of the impediments that is mentioned is the lack of a governance system to deal with systemic change. And I'm not surprised, because traditionally government and governance systems have been organized rather vertically, by sector or by topic. And the Green Deal in its essence is calling for a more systemic approach. And that means doing things in a different way, not only doing different things. And so we will at all levels have to reflect that sort of systemic governance capacity in what we have to do. Another element that I find good and that will require debate, of course, is the fact that the survey points at what we would call block-ins or blockages or lock-ins that are important, and it points at specific systems. The food system, we know that this is a really hard nut to crack. But it will need to be cracked, that not only for the food system itself, also for biodiversity, also for the climate file. So really focusing the attention on that, I think, is necessary. And that is where you make the link between policy formation and implementation. That's where interest groups come in. That's where lobbying comes in. That's where knowledge plays a role, and finding the right balance there in line with the necessary objectives, I think, is obvious. I think the just transition focus is also of interest, because I think that is by now a mantra that comes back, leaving nobody behind. But it's also a mantra where we have rather poor knowledge base. We don't have a strong European level tradition of linking socioeconomic data to climate and environmental data. So building up that knowledge base, I think, in support of a policy to make it more science and knowledge-based will be important. And then as an opener, a last thing is we've heard the president of the Commission say multiple times that you can only manage what you measure or steer what you measure. Well, we know that there is a whole host of initiatives taking place at this moment to monitor and keep track of the policy ambitions at this level. So indeed, coherency there is important. We are embedded in most of those as well. And so we are willing to contribute, of course, in a serious way. And linking that to the EU as a global standard setter, rather recently, the natural capital accounting that was done by Eurostat, the JRC, and ourselves at the agency was elevated to the global standard at the UN level, which I think clearly shows that Europe has the capacity to do this. But at this moment, we are not requiring member states to do natural capital accounting. And if we want to steer by measuring things and by good indicators, I think the Green Deal is almost begging for a stronger set of high-level indicators that would be the equivalent to the GDP over time to steer in this direction. And I'm sure I could talk on for 3 hours, but that's exactly what you don't want me to do. So I'll give it back to you, Robert.
Hans, thanks very much. I think there's quite a lot there that we'll delve into actually during the course of the discussion. I've taken notes, but I'd like to give Diederik the floor to address that first question, whether there was anything that particularly stood out for you, Diederik.
Thank you, Robert, and congratulations to all of you with this excellent tool that we will be watching with huge interest in the coming years, because it will guide us, or it will tell us a bit more on what the outside world is seeing and what they expect. And actually, my conclusion from this is that the outside world has been paying attention, because you can see that the trust on the delivery of the Green Deal is quite skewed towards climate and energy policies, and there's less, well, visibility by the outside from the outside world on let's say the biodiversity and the other targets. And that's there's a good explanation for that. We have spent most of our political capital in the first years, or the first 1.5 years of the Green Deal, on exactly these climate and energy targets, for several reasons. Maybe because it is it does the political heavy lifting, the climate target. If we can get that right, the other stuff can follow, and that's how we build up the whole Green Deal. So I'm not surprised that the outside world, the stakeholders, think that we are doing a better job on climate and energy than we're doing on the other things. I want to ensure everybody outside there, however, that this is according to plan. So what we will do as soon as we have put the Fit for 55 package on the table, which will be another splash on climate and energy policy somewhere in the course of, let's say, June, July. So that will skew your stakeholders even further into the conviction that it's a climate and energy deal and not a Green Deal as a whole. But I want to ensure you that we have in the planning to just after that to focus all our attention, or a lot of our attention, on especially the biodiversity and nature part of the things. But because if you want to compare apples with oranges, which you shouldn't, but nevertheless, you could almost argue that the loss of biodiversity is even a bigger threat to future generations than climate change. Again, it's apples and oranges, so both are a huge threat to future generations, but we should pay attention to both. So let me assure all the viewers that the Green Deal is still that comprehensive plan that has one vision for one ecosystem in which everything is connected with everything else. So we are not going to be trapped into a siloed approach towards one of the items within the Green Deal, be it climate, be it energy, be it transport, or whatever. No, we still think we are even more convinced, maybe by the pandemic, that showed us literally that everything is connected with everything else in our ecosystem. We are even more convinced that this is one vision, one plan for one ecosystem, and we should take care that the whole wagon sticks together. While at the same time, we're also living in a political reality in which we have to do things one by one. We cannot just dump the whole thing on a table and ask the 27 member states to just agree on it. That's not how it works. So we also have to define and implement a Gossamer strategy to get every member state on board in the context of leaving no one behind, the just transition. And we've been working on the first parts of that. I'm very happy that we agreed on a climate law, that we enshrined the -55 or even a little more than that into that very important law of laws in terms of climate and energy policy. We're now going to roll out the Fit for 55 package again, which will pay tribute to a lot of attention to, again, climate and energy. But just after that, we have a whole work program going on, both in strategies, but more importantly in legislative initiatives to also save our biodiversity and create a circular economy, stop the pollution of soil, water and air. So all the other parts of the Green Deal. And I hope that will be reflected in your next barometer.
Thanks very much, Diederik, for those reflections. I want to follow up because the presentation by Caroline started off by looking at the confidence people had in the implementation of the Green Deal by 2024. And I want to sort of poke you a little bit on this question of implementation. You've set out a whole raft of strategies and legislative proposals and revisions that are coming up. But it's when the rubber hits the road that I really want to get into, ask you about, and that's a question of if there is a lack of confidence around implementation, what do you think needs to happen in order for implementation really to bite, for the changes to happen on the ground? And I'll ask that of Hans to start off with.
Well, I'm not surprised that there are doubts around implementation, because there is a history in the EU system to set targets and then to have a so-called implementation gap. Our State and Outlook of the Environment 2020 report, in the three main categories on natural capital, on low carbon and circular economy, and on health and well-being and the environment, illustrates that there are rather significant implementation gaps, and I think that should be an absolute priority. Yeah, but you cannot just expect better implementation. That requires, I think, focus on compliance. But it in this case, I think, requires also focus on what would be the driver of better implementation at a more fundamental level. And I think this relates to incentive structures in the economy that are shifting, for example, through tax systems, subsidy systems, sustainable economy, finance taxonomies that give strong direction. So implementation is a complex matter, and I think making sure that actors understand that implementation is serious, that's compliance, follow-up, monitoring, being fast in sending signals, but at the same time also making sure that we are shifting the structural context for implementation, given the fact that this is a far more ambitious and fundamental set of policies. The 55% reduction in greenhouse gases will not happen with implementing better what we are doing today. It will require shifting the context for that goal, and we will have to make sure that that is part of a vision on implementation. So I think that's where the real challenge is. The other challenge with implementation is that we are focusing on what we should do more and differently. And that's an inherently optimistic curve. I mean, we experiment with new stuff, we scale it up, we speed it up, and there is a breakthrough. But what is holding back implementation increasingly is that we don't focus enough on what we should be phasing out, what we should be stepping away from. And the sooner we scale up and speed up unhelpful practices, whether it is investments in carbon and fossil fuels, whether it's subsidy systems that are not working, whether it's tax systems that go against, whether it's legal things that go against the Green Deal implementation, I think we should focus as well on what we should stop doing and step out of, because that creates the space for more rapid and more credible and full implementation of these objectives. So those would be a number of thoughts that are in line with the analyses that we've made over the last couple of years in the agency.
Thank you very much, Hans. Accountability, incentives, and stop doing things that are in a sense undermining the achievement of the Green Deal. Diederik, over to you. I mean, thinking about the implementation gap, how are we going to bridge that in the most effective way? And who should?
Yeah. let me add to Hans's very thorough analysis a few other items. I think it all comes down to what I call credible determination. And what I mean with that is that we as legislators, as representatives of the public, have to show determination that we really want this to change. And that determination has to be credible. And I think the credibility was lacking in let's say, the past 3 or 4 decades, in which stakeholders and actors in this system that were reluctant to move always could bet on government to back down in the end if nothing happened anyway. So, and that determination is not determined by our skills or the beauty of our legislative proposals. It's actually determined by society. And that's what actors and stakeholders, companies and others are looking at. They're looking at society and see, is this change for real? Is this really going to happen? And indeed, will this translate into legislation, etc.? But that's not the most important question. The most important question is society determined to make this happen? And I think we are we're seeing a momentum out there in society that we've never seen before. And that's what will make the difference, in my view. And obviously we have to translate that, and I feel that as a huge responsibility on our shoulders. We have to translate that momentum into the right actions, into the right financial mechanisms, into the right legislation. And yes, and we can screw up with that if we don't do it right. But the other way around will never work. We can do as much legislation and financial incentives and whatever we can. If society is not on the same footing, stakeholders, companies, actors are still going to bet on, well, this will die out in the end, and we can just continue with business as usual. The difference is you can watch it all over the place, but the most important, the best way to watch it is talk to, for instance, talk to people who think they are very important, and sometimes they are. So it's high civil servants, it's government leaders, it's CEOs. In those conversations I have with them in the last 1.5 years, in every conversation, at one point, it turns to their own children. And the funny part of that is the story is always the same, whether it's the CEO of Daimler-Benz or the government leader of one of the member states, of a secretary general of a ministry of environment. It turns to their children, and their children are asking questions, small questions about why do we eat meat, bigger questions about why do we still fly to Bali for a holiday, and existential questions on, hey dad, what are you doing to save my future? And the good part of those conversations is that they really change the world. Because for a CEO of Daimler-Benz, a bad shareholders meeting is a bad day, true. And a bad headline in the newspaper, the Financial Times, is a bad day. But not being able to answer your own children, that's much more than a bad day. That's existential. And while that is happening all over Europe, on every kitchen table, almost every day, that is what makes the change. And that is why I'm so optimistic that this will happen. And we can see it. I give you one more example. We produced a hydrogen strategy last year, with some, to be honest, pretty crazy numbers in there. And putting 6 gigawatt of electrolyzer capacity fed by green electricity online in 2024. That is a mind-boggling figure, which would create rolling eyes all over the place only a few years ago, maybe only 1 year ago. But now it changed the investment plans of a lot of the big players, because apparently they think this determination that we showed in this strategy is credible. So they thought, okay, if 6 gigawatt is now the new milestone for 2024, we better step up to the plate. And we change our investment plans, and we increase our investments into those hydrogen electrolyzers or the whole infrastructure around it. And what we see at the moment is that those investments are changing the dynamics and the economy around hydrogen. We're not there yet, but it's a good sign. And it's one example of where all those steps, but underpinned by that society that wants change and that talks about change, and especially the young generation that's driving that change, is going to make that change.
Thanks very much, Diederik, for that very optimistic note. I'm seeing quite a lot happening in the chat here, which is both saying, well, it's all very good having this optimism, but actually that should then be setting a playing field for the governments and for the Commission to be ambitious, to push forward the agenda. And yet we see that there are areas where that is proving difficult, and it's not quite accelerating as fast as we would like, despite, yeah, as you say, some amazing stuff on hydrogen and in other areas. So perhaps Celine would like to give us the realistic as well as the optimistic view. So over to you, Celine.
Thanks. I actually share Diederik's optimism. I think it's important to look at the specific question of the survey, because it says, is it likely to be implemented by 2024? And that's a crucial element. If you know how long it takes to implement legislation in Europe. So I think we need to keep that in mind. Where people pessimistic about implementation, i.e. it's not going to happen, or where they're saying it's going to take longer than the current Commission, which I think brings all sorts of questions as to, you know, what will happen to the Green Deal by the end of the current Commission. I mean, it is based on a communication. Obviously, there will be certain things enshrined in legislation, like the climate law and many other laws to come. But there is a big debate to be had as to, you know, what brings us all the way to 2030, and should we not already think about the Green Deal being a European project that would take us to 2030 or even 2050. The second reason why I'm also optimistic is that I do agree also with Diederik that we are seeing a societal change. And if you remember big changes, abortion, gay marriage, society moves first, then business moves, and then governments move last. And I do think, I mean, I've been following sustainability for many years. I do think that indeed the conversations are very different. As a mother, I must say that my kids are very eco-anxious. So what they say is that we know we will not be alive by 2050. And I must say that when they say that, my heart drops. And I keep telling them, no, we are going to do this. We can't leave this burden to you, the next generation. And so in terms of implementation, I want to say two more things. One is we are publishing a paper on targets and indicators for the Green Deal. And we think it's really super important to have science-based quantitative targets for all the pillars of the Green Deal. Because what we have seen in the past is that areas which are not based on very clear quantitative science-based targets do not see a whole lot of implementation. So we have some suggestions around that. The second element, and this is building on what is going on in the chat, is that I do think we have a massive opportunity for deepening democratic conversations about what are the fundamental values of our society. What will we value, and therefore we continue? What will we need to stop? I mean, if we want to reduce our material footprint, this means doing nutrition, housing, lifestyle, mobility completely differently. And therefore, I think empowering local authorities and finding ways through, you know, the new consultative processes that have emerged to deepen democratic debate about what societies want to be a critical element. And therefore, the first step is really to talk about the Green Deal to citizens and to talk to them about a deal. What is it you will get back? You know, I want citizens to hear about pollution dividends, because if we only go to talk to them and say this is all about pain and no gain, we were going to be having a real difficult time convincing them to change their behavior.
Thank you very much, Celine. I'd like to zoom in on one part of the survey results, which were these focus areas. And there were 3 that were identified as being particularly important because of their potential to unlock other achievements. And those 3 areas were circular economy, food systems, and biodiversity. And in particular, if we just start with circular economy, we have an industrial strategy, we have a circular economy action plan, number 2. And my question there is really, what's happening next? How do we actually implement these things? What is missing to actually make these transition from being areas of potential to be areas that actually are systemic levers for change? And I would like to ask that of Hans to start with, please.
Well, I think the emphasis on the circular economy is absolutely critical for several reasons. We know that we will not go to carbon neutrality without an economy that is much more circular than we have today. It's not just an add-on. It's not a separate objective. It is about the consumption, but primarily the production phase, the resources we use, and the impact on society. So this is critical to sort out. Now, I think it's fair to say that Europe has been in the lead with framing the concept of the circular economy, with also creating the legislative and the institutional frameworks around it. I mean, we are clearly in the lead. At the same time, we know from analyses and numbers that it is an idea that is very slow in its implementation at the moment. And we're at about 12-13% circularity. It's growing really slowly. So the emphasis in the Green Deal on translating the circular economy now into concrete sort of targets and objectives, also at sectoral level, think of the textile sector and a number of other sectors, is fundamental. Yeah. The other fundamental link, I think, is with the chemical strategy, because at the end of the day, it's the type of molecules that we produce, and that's what the chemical sector does. They produce molecules for other sectors to use, will determine to a large extent how easy it will be to keep materials, molecules into the cycle. Yeah? Another element of circularity will be ownership. Who is the owner and so has the responsibility of materials? And we think in many ways of a service economy. Well, can we think of material use also as a service? But the ownership and the responsibility remains with the first owner of the materials, because then they would probably reflect much more carefully about how they use materials and how they have to deal with them at the end of the life cycle. And then the third element is, of course, a legislative and in terms of regulatory context, because for now, to keep materials into the cycle is quite challenging because our legislation is not adapted yet to circularity. So I would just mention those 3 elements, but the idea is there, we are in the lead, but now we need to scale it up and we need to speed up that scaling up because it's a very slowly evolving reality. The ideas are evolving much faster than the reality at this moment. And that's where I think the real challenge is now. But that is embedded in the Circular Economy Action Plan and the next phases. So we are looking forward to seeing how that is going to materialize, pun intended. Okay.
Thank you very much, Hans. Diederik, it's the same sort of question. I really want to focus on this, but perhaps you can also reflect on how competitiveness is part of the ingredient here. And this perhaps links also to the fact that Europe has the opportunity to be a market maker, perhaps, for a circular economy and for a green industrial revolution.
Yeah, certainly. And we touched upon it earlier. There's less trust and less visibility of the circular economy part of the Green Deal than, for instance, the energy and climate part of the Green Deal. And I think all of us have striving for a sustainable future for, well, in my case, my whole adult life, and some of you longer than I have done this. we recognize that the circular economy is sometimes, it's as if at the end of the meeting, somebody's raising its finger and say, hey, oh yeah, we should do something about the circular economy, and everybody already packing its bags, etc., says yes, we're going to do that next time. That's a bit where the circular economy is right now. The good part of this story is that this is exactly where only 5 years ago renewable energy was, where at the end of the meeting, a boy or a girl raised its finger and said, no, we should do more about renewable energy. And everybody packing its bags said, yeah, going to do that next time. And now, all of a sudden, renewable energy is big business, mainstream. Nobody doubts it. It's number 1, 2, and 3 on the agenda meeting. It's not in the A or B section anymore. We can't wait another 5 years for circular economy. So to move that up on the agenda, because Hans is right, it is not a nice to have, it's a precondition for a sustainable future. And I'm sure, and people do not acknowledge it yet, and we have to show still, we have to prove that we are determined here, but we are as determined here as we are with climate. We are going to produce legislation which is the equivalent of the climate law. And in this case, it's the sustainable products policy. It's the way we make and use, and in the end, sometimes throw away our products. And we're going to revolutionize that. And with that, we're going to put Europe on the forefront of the circular economy as indeed the biggest market in the world still at the moment. And how are we going to do that? Well, actually, we are already regulating almost every product that is on the market in Europe. I mean, if I lift the thing that I'm now talking into, which is a microphone, there's a CE logo on the back. And that means that there's conditions that the European Union has set on this specific thing. Well, the conditions that the European Union has now described for this thing is that it doesn't set itself on fire, which is not very ambitious. So what we should do is move forward with that and say, okay, we can also prescribe what the materials are that this product is made of, and whether they are recyclable or reusable, or whether the product is actually repairable halfway through its lifetime, so that we give it another lifetime. In order to illustrate that, I should actually have lifted this thing, which you cannot even change the battery of. So we need to prescribe the products much more ambitious in their circularity. We can, and we also know that it will deliver us a competitive advantage. Because if we move first, and we've done that in the past many times, we've also failed many times on doing that, and we see the fruits of that with the technology being in China or elsewhere. This time, we should be the ones moving first. We will be the ones moving first, and it will deliver our industry a competitive advantage.
Thanks very much, Diederik and Hans, on those issues. I'd like to, before I actually open the Q&A, I'd like to go to the other parts of that focus, those 3 focus areas. That was food systems and biodiversity. And you heard Celine actually making a very clear call for the need to set targets around biodiversity. And this is an area that does seem to have been a headache for a number of decades. And it does seem to be one of those areas where it would be in line with Hans's suggestion that we stop doing things that are harmful to the achievement. So really, I want you to seriously engage with the issue of how on earth are you going to align something like a farm to fork strategy with a CAP and also with the biodiversity, which you yourself, Diederik, have said is almost as important, if not more important, than the climate goals and the climate crisis that we're facing. So how are we going to do this? Because it's not happened for the last 30 years or so.
You're addressing that to me?
Yeah, you get it first.
No problem. Yeah, no problem with that. Indeed, people are right in looking at that spot of the Green Deal and identifying a weak spot. Our common agricultural policy, which is the main driver of Europe since it started, basically, has grown into that super tanker that is pretty difficult to change course of. And before everybody starts yelling at the common agricultural policy, it's an income instrument for millions, tens of millions of people in Europe called farmers. And for instance, if you would argue in a country to take the pension away from all the pensioners, that's the equivalent of destroying the common agricultural policy. Just to underline that, it's not that easy because it's deeply enshrined into a social economic policy that you cannot just change course of. And hence our idea of the farm to fork, which is actually a horizontal, a different beast in our legislative framework that can change without having to, well, we also have to deal with the cap, but apart from that, we can deal with pesticides, we can deal with fertilizers, we can deal with organic farming from the farm to fork strategy. And I'm optimistic that we can do that. One caveat with that, because yes, we have to change the common agricultural policy. Yes, we have to use the farm to fork in order to create a sustainable farming practices in Europe. But most of all, we have to change our diet. And that's not up to me or you or whoever. That's up to 500 million people out there. As I said, I'm hugely optimistic about our future. I think we can live with 12 billion people on Earth, and so much brace for it, because we might be with so many somewhere halfway of the century. We can live with those people in incredible well-being. Let's call it European well-being, which is incredible at the moment. And we can do that with 12 billion people. However, we cannot all eat like Europeans do today. If 12 billion people adopt the European diet, let alone the American diet, we need 2 or 3 planet Earth, and we don't have them. So yes, we also need to change that, and which is a much more fundamental question than legislating the use of fertilizer. I mean, that's easy peasy compared to the real thing and the real change that also needs to take place while we are doing this. And I don't want to, well, I would like to put a challenge out there, indeed, because the Green Deal hasn't picked up on that yet. What we do is we withdraw some of the advertisement on red meat, which is, well, you could say a step forward, but it's nothing compared with what we actually need to do in order to convince all of us, ourselves actually, to change our diet. We don't have to do that tomorrow, but we have to do that in the course of the next 10 years in order to become really sustainable.
Thank you very much. I'm going to give the floor to Celine quickly, and then Hans, and then we'll open for questions. Celine.
Just quickly wanted to comment around on biodiversity on one of the striking findings of the survey, that there seems to be very mixed views between stakeholders how important biodiversity is. And that is something that certainly surprised me, to see that there's still much more enthusiasm for acting on biodiversity within academia, think tanks, and civil society than within other stakeholders. And I think in spite of all the efforts, and I think we are really moving in the right direction right now in terms of setting the right narrative so people really get the importance of biodiversity, the survey shows that we still have a way to go for people to understand how vital it is to fight against the mass extinction of species.
Thanks, Celine. Hans.
Yes, Rob, thanks. First of all, I would like to say I am really glad that biodiversity is getting the political attention that it deserves. It's essential that we understand that the natural capital, and I know some people even abhor the term capital for it, but I'll use it anyway. The natural capital on which we live, that is the boundary, the condition for human existence, that we take care of that. And it is one of the core policy fields where Europe has seen an implementation gap. In 2000, Europe said we will hold biodiversity loss. In 2010, that didn't happen, and we said we'll do it by 2020. In 2020, that didn't happen. And of course, a credible response was not, well, you know what, we'll do it by 2030. So the credible response in policy framing is now the biodiversity strategy. Yeah? And I think if that is going to be successful, we need to address the 3-4 crucial elements that drive biodiversity loss. And that is landscape fragmentation to a large extent, that is pollution, that is an agricultural system that is a threat to biodiversity, and increasingly that is also the independent factor of climate change, yeah? Because of water systems, I mean, all of the stuff that comes with climate change. So we need to address those if we're going to deal with biodiversity, and the food system is a critical element, because when Diederik said we need to change our habits, well, there have been some exercises done by scientists, including ourselves, that if you would move to a World Health Organization type diet, which they recommend, you would have a totally different map of Europe in terms of land use, in terms of impacts on environment, on climate, on waterways, on all of those elements. So that is indeed a critical debate to be had. But beyond that, I think one of the elements that is actually critical is that the cap is indeed an economic instrument. And maybe that's where one of the problems is, because we have a food system at the moment, and I've said this before in public, where we pay 4 times for our food. A first time when we buy it in the store, a second time to subsidize the farmer. Well, I think we need to go to a food system that delivers a fair and decent income to the people who produce our food. It's a bit bizarre that most of them can only survive in a decent way if we subsidize them. Why is that not embedded in a fair price for food? Well, the answer is in the food system, because they are stuck between a rock and a hard place. The agrochemical input industries, which own a lot of what they do in many ways, and the food industry that squeezes the lowest possible milk price or meat price or any other price out of them. So focusing on their position as a precarious position, I think, is fundamental. Yeah. And then we pay a third time for our food when we deal with the climate and environment issues, and we pay a fourth time when we go to the doctor, because we've got a very safe food system in Europe, the safest on the planet, but not necessarily a healthy one. I mean, it's obvious that there is a better way of dealing with food in the 21st century. And I think that's where the combination of a farm to fork and a common agricultural policy should be addressing those societal economic elements, and at the same time, the major challenges of this century, which is dealing with a planet that we are overusing in such way that the essence of the food system will be at risk. So that more systemic approach should also serve the needs of the farmers, who at this moment, I think, are not served very well by a food system that doesn't stand up to their income needs and also recognition. I mean, these people are often blamed now. When they come on the street, they are the scapegoats of a food system, which is really bizarre. We should move away from that. It's terribly unhelpful in the debate with them.
Thanks very much, Hans. I'm going to start off our Q&A by asking Andreas Kramer from the Ecologic Institute to kick us off with a question. So, Andreas, I think you're actually inside our Zoom webinar, so perhaps you can turn on your camera and ask your question.
I did turn on my camera, and I am happy to follow these absolutely fabulous comments that were made by Diederik Samson, Hans Breunings, and the presentation of the report by the IEEP and GlobeScan. Wonderful, thank you very much. However, listening to the discussion, I'm really disturbed by, on the one hand, the urgency of the issues, and on the other hand, the time scale that you seem to imply. It's going to take 10 years, it's going to take long, and even also in the comments, in the chat, I see that many people ask fundamental questions about getting the right system of governance in place. All of these things take too much time, and I want to put the focus on something that is very often overlooked. It is 2.4 trillion and rising. 2.4 trillion euros are currently sitting in household bank accounts, in savings accounts, and in current accounts. They're not invested money. This is not invested in stock and shares. This is pent-up spending money. And when it will be spent, as soon as the pandemic restrictions are lifted, it will reinforce the current unsustainable patterns of production, trade, consumption, and perhaps investment too. So with this much money sloshing about and waiting to be spent, not over 10 years, but over 18 to 24 months, is this not a good time to think about subsidy reform, abolish all those perverse subsidies in the agricultural sector, in the fisheries sector, but also in buildings and in energy use? Not only the perverse subsidies, but also the tax exemptions and other privileges that harm the environment. So what can, Derek Sampson, what can be done? What is the European Commission going to do this year about consumption taxes, about energy taxes, about VAT differentiation perhaps, allowing member states to make sure that things that are produced in unsustainable ways are clearly more expensive than things that are produced in a sustainable way? And is there not at the same time a clear and present risk that the EU sustainable finance taxonomy legislation comes A, too late, and is B, weakened too much? So what are you going to do this year in order to avoid creating new path dependencies and unsustainable patterns, as this massive amount of money is going to stimulate the economy, but reinforcing the existing structures? Thank you.
Thank you. Let me give you a depressing and an optimistic part of that answer. The depressing part is as follows. We will run as fast as we can with the new energy taxation directive. In fact, within 2 months from now, we will put a revolutionary energy taxation directive on the table, the first since 2003, because that was the last time we overhauled that directive, and you can see how obsolete and all that is. That sounds good, eh? So a direct answer to your question, within 2 months we will do this. And then member states will bicker about 1.5 years before implementing it, if they implement it at all, because you need unanimity to change the energy taxation directive. So that's also the reality of how European legislation and European progress works. On the other hand, the more optimistic part of the answer is, because we've been looking at these exact numbers that you were just quoting, over 2 trillion in savings money, in household savings money. And indeed, when opening up after the pandemic, everybody wants to go into a roaring 20 type of spending because, well, we want to celebrate opening up. I actually feel that personally, and I think we all do. What about spending that money in renovating your house? Renovating and insulating your house, putting solar panels on the roof, an intelligent energy system in-house, and if you have even more spare money, think about changing your car into an electrical one. I mean, the real investments and the real spending can also be done in the right direction, and it can be and it can happen very quick. We are now at the moment doing the public part of that, no 2 trillion, but 750 billion. Not small beer either. 750 billion in terms of Next Generation EU will be put on into practice, into real investments in the coming 2 to 3 years, starting as of July. And what we have been working on 24/7 in the last 2 to 3 months is convincing member states to deliver the right plans for that. And I can tell you, we've come a long way. There's still gaps. There's still dirty parts, or let's say loose ends in the whole system, but you can see Italy, Spain, France, Portugal moving billions of euros into renewable or sustainable technology. If that is accompanied with that private money, which is surplus, which is a factor, not an order of magnitude, but of 3-4 times bigger than the public money available, we can really make a change in the next 3 to 4 years already. And that's the time frame that we're looking at.
I'd like to follow up actually on that, Diederik. I saw recently that France and Germany were calling on the Commission to really ensure that the money from Next Generation can be spent, and they're looking for quick sort of ratification or approval of these recovery plans. Given that political pressure that is on you, and there are also elections coming up, I'm just wondering, do you really think that the Commission will be able to ensure that those recovery funds are aligned with the Green Deal, which is what Celine was calling for earlier on?
Yeah, I think we did. First in our regulation, and then in our guidelines, which is all paper, so nothing yet. But now in the real plans that we will see in the coming days. Actually, we saw a few of them already. And the approval process of that will take place in the next 2 months. So before the 1st of July, most of those recovery and resilience plans will be approved of. And of those plans, at least 40%, and in some cases much more, but at least 40% of the investments will go directly into renewable, and none of the investments can do any significant harm. So that's how the framework that we build. 20% of the money has to go to digital innovation and infrastructure. Some of that is coinciding with sustainable infrastructure, not all. So you can't say that 100% of the money is spent in wind farms and solar panels, but quite a lot of it. And we are optimistic, and we see those plans. I have to make a little disclaimer here, though, because the speed at which we can deploy that money is pretty dependent on the own resource decision. The capacity for the Commission to borrow that money on the private market, on the financial markets, and we're still awaiting a few member states that have to, put the gavel down on that particular piece of legislation. Finland, Poland, and also the Constitutional Court in Germany put their hands on the brake, but obviously, luckily, they have given the go-ahead very recently. So it's all done in a breakneck speed, in a very tight time schedule. But so far, I'm still hopeful that we will make all the deadlines.
Thanks very much, Diederik. There are quite a lot of questions coming in, I think inspired by Hans talking about the need to make sure that there are indicators so that we can really measure progress on implementation. And Hans, I think that people would like to hear a little bit more about the sorts of indicators that will be required to monitor this progress. People are talking about how to do this in alignment with SDGs, how to do it in alignment with biodiversity and natural capital. So I wonder whether you could perhaps talk us a little bit about what's in place, what's lacking when it comes to indicators, and what needs to happen to make sure that they are in place and are being used.
Well, those are three different questions, I think. First of all, there are a lot of indicators already in place. Yeah, that is clear. They are being used today in a variety of ways. We are looking at SDG monitoring, which is led by Eurostat. We're looking at European Green Deal monitoring, the Zero Pollution Dashboard, the ATAP monitoring. There are initiatives across the board on a variety of levels. I think with the Green Deal, the interest of actors in the system to play a major role in one of those has grown, because this is the main political and policy sort of space now. So people want to be in there. I think what would be very useful is to extract a number of key indicators from what exists already that are not only looking at where we are, but also make a clear link with some of the origins of where we are, the drivers. And a good one, and I know it's a sensitive political debate in quite a number of member states, would be nitrogen loads. Yeah, nitrogen refers to the potential for biodiversity restoration, a main target. It is, of course, linked to the food system, to land use, to industry, to mobility, and we know what it is. Yeah, so we could make a good choice there. I think we also need to add some more systemic indicators. And with, for example, the Sustainable Finance Initiative, we will get required reporting on the proportion of investment portfolios that are, you could say, Green Deal compliant, and that comply with So you could start making an indicator that looks at how quickly we are shifting that part of the portfolios in the right direction. That would give you a sort of systemic investment indicator of where we are. I already mentioned the natural capital accounting, which I think could be much deeper embedded in the whole system as well. And the methodology is there, we just need to do it. And jokingly, I've said, if you go to an average hotel, remember those days in Europe when we actually traveled and went to a hotel, there are more people serving you coffee and breakfast in the morning than there are people in a member state working on natural capital accounting. Yet the methodology exists, we know how to do it, but there is no obligation to do it. So let's do that. And then thirdly, I think we have a need of forward-looking indicators of systemic nature. Yeah, and that can be, for example, because there is not one pathway towards the future. It will be about aligning policy initiatives, coherency. Well, can we come up with a monitoring of that? We will need a sort of more serious analysis done on longer term gaps, and that is forward-looking information systems that we need for that. We need foresight, which is now embedded with Mr. Šefčovič. So we have a number of initiatives there, but they are not embedded in, I would say, what is the core steering dashboard for some policies. So use what is there, but in the right way, develop more systemic and develop more forward-looking prospective type knowledge and indicators. That would be my short answer to that.
Thanks very much, Hans. Diederik, is there anything in terms of the data and the indicators that the Commission is using to both ensure compliance and enforcement, but also perhaps to design policies and legislation? Is there anything missing that you would like to see?
Yeah, it's not missing yet because it's there, but we can't get our hands on it yet because of, well, technology and maybe also some organizational issues. And that's what's happening on the ground. And we can look at that with, I must almost say, deadly precision from space. And we have the instruments to do so. And yet we are arguing with every member state for months and months every year. So actually around the clock, we are arguing with member states on how much forest they still have in place or what their land use actually is. And they give us figures and we say, well, that's pretty strange because we thought you had some clear cuts over there for forests, etc. While at the same time, we can look from space and we can see exactly per square meter what's happening. We need to ramp up our game over there. And we can, it's for the good cause. Obviously, there's also privacy and other issues involved. We will take care of that because we are that rules-based, free society in which people can move without being watched by the government. But we can look at trees, we can look at land use, we can look at everything else, and we can make our accounting so much better. And I think Hans is literally waiting in the hallways to make that happen. He has the instruments of it. We need the money to translate all that data into usable information, because that's what it's all about. And we obviously need the governance framework to allow us to do this with much more precision than we do today. So, but that's actually part of our Green Deal work. It's a bit in the shadow because why bother people with our accounting schedules? But it's very, very important, and we hope to get it up and running in the coming years in order to be much better equipped to steer our policies in the right direction.
Thanks, Diederik. There's also a lot of questions that have come up in the chat and the Q&A addressing the question of systemic governance. The Green Deal was there to look across silos, to find the horizontal tools that were required to make sure that we could actually bring a step change in a whole range of areas. And Hans, you talked about the need for systemic governance, and in fact that was something that came out of the survey. People are wondering, what does this actually mean? What does it entail? Is it about a reorganization of government? Is it about, are there other tools that will help us make sure that we take a systemic approach? We talked about systemic indicators, but what about the actual means of implementation? What can help us there?
Well, first of all, it starts from across government and governance institutions to start from the picture, the image of the system, and looking at where you are in the system and how it is related to other parts of the system. And that is not how we've made policies in countries in the last 20, 30 years. So starting from that fundamental position of seeing yourself as part of the system and connected to others, and then understanding fundamental elements like where are the drivers of potential change in this system. And if you are working on an environmental issue, the key driver or lock-in mechanism might be in the tax system or in the subsidy system. So understanding that and putting that together, looking at trade-offs, yeah. If I do this in this system, how is it linked to other things? Distributional issues, which I think are critical. If we're going to change towards sustainability, it is a societal change. Yeah, it's not just a change in technology. It's not just a change in how we think about climate and environment. So understanding that societal context and the trade-offs there, and I think distributional issues are absolutely critical in this agenda and underestimated in many ways. Yeah, so those elements are critical. And then what you would actually need is what you see in some member states. And I take the Netherlands as an example. They've got 3 planning bureaus. Yeah, and all 3 of them, one is more on economic stuff, one is more on environmental stuff, and the other one is more on social dimensions. The 3 of them have collaborated on a number of occasions to give a sort of integrated view on government policies, on implementation of a climate neutrality strategy, on, I think that sort of institutional linking as a starting position, not as something that you think of halfway through the element, and then you get the usual territorial battles, which we all know. That would be, I think, absolutely fundamental. And it would help people to design instruments and policies that take these things into account. And I want to finish by saying the social dimension is critical, because we're now dealing with the environment and climate externalities. We don't want to be dealing with the social externality in 20 years. It needs to be part and parcel of the solution. And that requires this integrated view, and it's laborious, but you save the time later on, yeah? Because afterwards you deal with the consequences of non-integrated policies. So let's invest from now on in a different type of engagement.
Diederik, briefly, can you also talk about how the Commission will be making sure that in future it is continuing to take this integrated view in terms of policy making?
Yeah, and that's quite a challenge in this pretty siloed organization. When I arrived here 1.5 years ago, I found an organization with 30,000 people that work 24/7 with huge dedication, and all have an IQ above 200, way smarter than I am. So that is a huge potential of an incredible machine that can do a lot of work. But I also discovered that indeed you have those DGs that work as little kingdoms with their own rules and regulations, and actually talk too little to the others. And it is, I think, one of the advantages of the von der Leyen Commission that we created that structure in which the EVP Timmermans can coordinate several policy fields, and the cabinet of Commissioner Timmermans, that is in my job description, has the obligation, the responsibility to take care that all the several kingdoms are going to be aligned in one beautiful country. And that's what we're doing right now. And we make mistakes on the way. I still discover that some people are working in one DG on a subject, and other people are working in another DG on exactly the same subject, but in a completely different direction. So as long as we discover that before we put anything out to you, we're doing a good job. But I can't guarantee that that will happen, always happen, but it's this sheer commitment of EVP Timmermans and his team to indeed treat this plan as one plan, one vision for, as I said, that one ecosystem. Because come to think of it, that is the only way to solve this issue.
Thanks.
If I can come in quickly, sorry. I think one issue that we also need to talk about is the silos within member states' governments. And within our work where we want to be looking at the means of implementation of the Green Deal, I think it's really important to see where are the member states where there is a Green Deal conversation, where those siloed ministries are speaking one with another. Because again, looking at the survey and the difficulties we have around implementation, obviously it's super important if the Commission can do this and show the way forward and the example, but there's going to be a lot of heavy lifting that will need to happen at the member state level to overcome those silos.
Thanks very much, Céline. We're reaching the end of today's event, and I want to make a quick reflection on some of the key elements that I've heard before handing back to Céline to round us off. And I think that one of the things that's come out very strongly in the survey, in the barometer, is the fact that there is a real need to make sure that there's enough awareness, not only among society at large, in order to enable these sorts of big systemic changes, but also among the people who are actually responsible for that implementation. It was striking to me that it was among member states and at local authorities where they have great responsibility, perhaps also lack some of the understanding and awareness of how their role is in the Green Deal and its implementation. Another thing that really stood out for me is the fact that there is a moment right now where there is a real demand and opportunity for those in power. That is the Commission, it is governments, but it's also the private sector to really make a step change and introduce completely new levels of ambition and investment in reaching the Green Deal, because now society seems to be actually calling for it, and now is the opportunity to seize that. And the last thing, which we haven't spent enough time talking about, is the role of the individual and the role of consumers in this. Yes, we need to make sure that they are able to also consume in a way that is reducing their material footprint, that is consuming less meat, that is actually building this natural capital and resilience that we're longing for. And that is another area that needs a lot more attention. So thank you very much for the presentations and for this panel discussion. And I will hand over to Céline to provide final words.
Well, I really wanted to thank everyone for this great debate this morning on the Green Deal. As a sustainability think tank, IEEP really tries to, together with Think 2030, together with its members at member state level, Andreas is one. We have also BC3 represented within Think Sustainable Europe to really bring the Green Deal community together so we can exchange ideas, but also gather force to keep up with this marathon that we're in and that we need to win, as we say, for next generations. And practically, we really want to make sure that we'll have even more partners when we run the next survey. So we have even more experts participating and the survey can be even more representative. And then the other thing we will be engaging the community to talk about indicators, especially around means of implementation of the Green Deal, with the hope next year to publish a first report that would include an enhanced version of the survey, but also an indicator set focused on means of implementation of the Green Deal as part of a first independent report to measure progress on the Green Deal. So stay tuned. And really looking forward to all your great ideas. And thank you so much for our panelists today. Super well appreciated. I know how busy they are. So thanks again for kicking us off so nicely. Thanks.